Well, it is officially 6 o'clock. So if you are ready, Martin, I'm ready to get started. Perfect.
Right.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's so nice to see your names on the screen. I would say your faces, but I can't see those. Thank you for coming to our virtual evening edition of If Cars Could Talk. We're very excited to host this program for you, and now from the comfort of your own home, and hopefully soon maybe back at the museum as well. My fingers are crossed. I'm very hopeful about that. My name is Kelsey Cross, and I am the education coordinator at LeMay, America's Car Museum. For more upcoming If Cars Could Talk information and to know about upcoming events and educational programs at the museum, please visit our website and subscribe to the museum's newsletter for the most up-to-date information on that. As you all know, at this point in time, things have been changing on the flip of a dime. But hopefully now, with everyone getting vaccinated and good to go, we can start to do more of these programs in person. But before we get into all of this fun stuff and we learn about the history of Pacific Raceways, I do have a couple of housekeeping rules that I want us to think about when we are going through this. If you have questions at any point during this presentation, you are more than welcome to type them into the Q&A box, which is usually at the bottom of your screen. You can type in your questions there, or you can raise your hand. For this presentation, our speaker Martin does not mind if you want to ask them periodically throughout the talk, or if you want to wait and save them towards the end, either is fine. We usually save about 10 to 15 minutes or so of the last part of the presentation so we can answer those questions. If you do end up using the Q&A box, just specify in there if you want your question answered now or if you want to wait until the presentation is over. If you are having any technical issues, there is a chat box down at the bottom, also usually towards the bottom of your screen in Zoom. Just type them into there and I will help you out as best as I can to get those resolved. You might have noticed when you joined this webinar that this is being recorded, just so everyone is aware. Once we are done, it usually takes us about a week to get the video uploaded, but it will be available on our website and also on our YouTube if you want to share it with any family and friends. And lastly, please have fun. That's why we're doing these. We want you to learn something and to engage in good conversation. So enough of me talking. I know that's not the real reason why you're here. Thank you all again so much for coming. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our speaker and our road racing historian, Martin Rideau, who's going to talk to us a little bit, or probably a lot of it, about Pacific Raceways and some of the history involved in that. So after you, it's all yours, Martin.
Okay, thank you, Kelsey. I'm hoping everybody is seeing our introductory screen with the title Pacific Raceways to Seattle International Raceways and back to Pacific Raceways. 60 plus years of racing. And needless to say, it's challenging enough to present 60 years of history in an hour. It's hard enough I could go on for probably an hour about 1 year of history, but what we're really going to talk about is the early history of Pacific Northwest. And it'd be fun to do another presentation on the later history, but we're really going to be talking about the 60s and early 70s here. I hope that's what everybody is tuned in expecting. Those were, the glory days of the track. I think that the best days of the track are still to come. A lot of exciting things happening. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end. But to launch right into this, I'll talk a little bit about my background when we get to that. Often these presentations are given kind of chronologically. I just thought I'd do something a little different. I don't know if we have any female listeners, but we're going to start off looking at some of the famous drivers that have been at Pacific Raceways. Right off the bat, I'm having a technical issue. Unable to advance my screen. Was working just fine. And here we go. Okay. Let's see if you recognize some of these people. Yeah, that's Paul Newman. He raced here. Here's kind of a ringer in the lineup. but a lot of people, especially women, are very excited the fact that Paul Newman did race here. Here he is in his car at Pacific Raceways. I must say it was in the early 80s, probably one of his worst racing weekends ever, but still he was here. Now, going back to some people that we may be more familiar with as race car drivers, here's three fabulous famous drivers that raced at Pacific Raceways. Dan Gurney in the middle, Dave McDonald on his left, and Bob Holbert. And what Dan Gurney is doing here is making fun of the way Dave used a cross-armed technique. Here's some other famous race drivers. We've got Mario Andretti, we've got Bobby Unser, and we've got Parnelli Jones, maybe some others here. And by the way, other people are certainly, if you know more than I do, which is quite possible, or you want to add something, you're certainly welcome to jump in on as we go through this. And then we'll start in a more chronological order. But it's fun to see these famous drivers. We still know of them. Here's Pedro Rodriguez, one of the great drivers of the 60s and 70s, Formula One, as well as many sports car championships here in 1963 for the US RRC race. We'll look at that later. Innes Ireland, famous international driver here for the what used to be the Pacific Grand Prix in the mid-60s. Phil Hill came up here to drive, car wasn't ready, so he ended up driving the pace car. And here he is with the Race Queen in 1962 or 62, I believe. What a baby face. Mark Donahue, one of everybody's favorite racers. Captain Nice, here he is in one of his early appearances at Pacific Raceways. And here is Graham Hill, another very famous international driver in a Lotus 19 at the 1963 Northwest Grand Prix. Jerry Grant, here's quite a story about this famous Seattle area driver. What he was doing here, he was in the middle of the race, driving sans helmet. It's a story there, of course, there always is. Ken Miles, who's gotten a huge, thanks to the recent movie, of course, very famous guy now. He raced here 3 times, and here he is in 1964, tuning his Cobra. Interesting, he was doing the work himself. And Lloyd Ruby, more famous as perhaps an oval track racer, heck of a road racer here in 1963. And Carroll Shelby, never raced here, but was here with a team for Trans Am in the late 60s. And our own famous Pete Lovely, in my mind, the best driver ever to come out of the Northwest, present company accepted, I suppose. So we have a question. He said he'll be patient.
I think he was waiting for you to talk a little bit about yourself, and I
will in just a moment. Yes. I want to talk about other people first. Yes. Some local heroes that a lot of them are kind of forgotten now. I just had to bring them up. Bob McLean, fabulous driver from BC in the early 60s. John Randall, longtime top BC driver, won everywhere he went. Lyle Forsgren, who revolutionized H production racing and went on all through the 60s, a very successful driver. Al Lader, who was from Portland, who raced here a lot in Formula B. Wade Carter, tremendous local driver, raced Porsches starting in the early days of Pacific Raceways, all the way up to his untimely death, not in racing, in vintage racing. Mike Irely, possibly was going to be a superstar. His career got cut short for a couple of reasons, but very successful here. Jerry Brule, another really, really successful driver locally and nationally. Stan Burnett, his famous Burnett specials were racing all through the 60s. Monty Shelton, up from Portland, raced here a lot, raced nationally with Trans Am. Lou Florence, you could write a book about Lou, started out racing midgets and dirt tracks in the mid-40s, went on to race into the early 70s. And Don Jensen, the most unlikely survivor of all the early years of racing, talked to Don just last week, still going strong at 91. And I just had to mention these guys, and we'll start with the more traditional entrance. 2, Pacific Raceways, early days, very early days. Now, this photo was taken by a friend of my dad's. I actually could have taken this photo because my association with the track goes back to before it opened, under construction. I'm a local guy. My dad started racing in 1956 with an SAC, and we went to the SACA Nationals in Bremerton that year. And from then on, all through my teenage years and early 20s, I was a racing fanatic, couldn't wait to race myself. In the fall of 1959 at the Seattle Auto Show, there was a big, boy, I'd love to have this, a big paper mache rendering of 3-dimensional, of course, about 3 feet long and about a foot high, of the new Pacific Raceways track. Everybody was excited. In the summer of 1960, a friend of mine and I drove out to Pacific Raceways, found it, snuck out through the woods back here to look at the track. And I remember road graders going down this main straightaway. Those who know Pacific Raceways realize this is turn 8 heading into turn 9. And there was the track upon completion. This is from 1960-61 map. You see, it doesn't look a lot different today. The biggest difference would be at turn 9 and the paddock. Or turn 9 is still the same. The paddock is no longer there. We'll talk about that in a minute. But now we join this drag strip right up here by the start line. So we no longer join the drag strip at launch area, which produced a lot of challenges. Interesting what they talked about what the track was going to look like. There was a bridge planned over the track. A lot of things were planned that didn't come to pass, but the track has been upgraded a lot recently and is still one of the finest racing facilities, you know, if you could say actually in the world, certainly in North America, and certainly one of the prettiest too. At the beginning, the track was not real pretty. Look at this. I know what races was. It wasn't really important. What you can see here, the way the surroundings of the track looked. And you could sit up here where I hope you can see my pointer. This is one of the vantage areas. You also could come down here. But when cars would go off the track in those days in this area, they would raise incredible clouds of dust when it was a hot day. And it was in most of the big races. Most of them had nice weather. There'd be a huge cloud of dust and everybody would run over there to look over and see what happens. And I have a picture that I cannot find. I'll find it someday, of my dad right about here in an Alpha, and he's looking up the hill, and about up here is a guy in a Sprite starting to roll down the hill. And you know, you could supply your own caption. Anyway, cars went, you could see how cars could go a long ways up there, just launch right up in the hill when they couldn't make that turn. Looks a lot different now. It's very lush green. There are trees all over the place, nice underbrush. Now here it looks more like a track out in the desert. So Pacific Raceways first road race. You know, the first weekend at Pacific Raceways was really featured a drag race, but there also was an IndyCar race for the Northwest type IndyCars, roadsters. Here's one of them. I have another picture of the same guy with his nose on. Obviously, IndyCars didn't do great on the track. They weren't really made to turn both directions. And this poor guy lost the nose of his car, but it gave him better cooling and he kept right on going. And here's a program from that race. Anybody want to jump with any questions, you know, feel free. Here's the first race of the first road race at Pacific Raceways. It was August 14th. And it's a frequently seen shot, but I really felt like I had to include it. So many of the top cars and drivers of the day are in there, and we could talk about each one of them. I know I was there that day. My dad raced that day. Didn't do tremendously well, but he had kind of an unfortunate car for him, a Lotus Elan. No, this is not him. This is the pace car. You can see there's a lot of really great cars back here. Jerry Grant is starting way back here because he didn't finish one of the pre-qualifying events. So as the year went on, the next big race at the track was really Seafair. Seafair had races at Shelton, Washington. Some of you were probably in my last seminar where I talked about South Sound racing. And it was a really big race. It was the biggest race of the year for a few years, the Seafair race. And Seafair also put on, or helped put on, the SCCA Nationals of Bremerton. So for a few years, the Pacific Raceways, a big race, the biggest race or a big race was the Seafair race. And here is Stan Burnett and the Vaness Special being driven by probably Tom Vaness at the time. There are two terrific cars of the early 60s. The Vaness Special first had Ford powered, was put together by a guy out in Renton named Tom Vaness. And then it was a Devon body, which he altered a bit. Then he put a Chevy engine in it, and he was pretty successful. But the guy coming up behind him, Stan Burnett, ended up being much more successful as the years went on, and he built more and more Burnett Specials, an iconic car from the 60s. You can see up the hill where spectators are. We'll see a lot more spectators later. Now here's just another look at the track, how scraped it was in those days. This is in the same race weekend. It's a good panorama of turns 2 and 3. Turns 3A and 3B. And again, everything is pretty scraped out. All this area is still here. It's just all grown up now, overgrown. Now here's 1962 Seafair race, the start of the Seafair race. There's a lot of great cars here. Jerry Grant, there's the Vaness Special again. Here's one of my favorite cars of the 60s. You can see, I'm sure you can see where my arrow is pointing. This is a Porsche Special built and driven by a guy named Jim Rattenbury out of BC. Amazing guy, very talented. He had his own ideas about aerodynamics. This car was pretty successful when it had a bigger Porsche engine. It was later rebodied and raced again by a gentleman named Mike Campbell. He took that bizarre fin off. But this car was a pretty successful car, despite how odd it looks. You can see down the line, there's a lot of very neat cars here. Specials, Lotuses. Jerry Grant won this race, as it wasn't a particularly difficult field, and got an enormous trophy for his troubles. But now we're getting into where the really big time races started at Pacific Raceways. The 1962 Northwest Grand Prix. This was it's something that didn't quite take off, and it's too bad. It kind of took off. It was going to be the West Coast Grand Prix. Riverside, Laguna Seca, and Pacific Raceways. We're going to have 3 races called the Pacific Coast Grand Prix. And hopefully the same fields would go to each of them. They were going to be really big races. They were put on by the USAC at the time. And sure enough, a lot of very exciting cars did come to this event. And this is, perhaps certainly one of the most exciting and certainly the fastest. It's Dan Gurney in a Lotus 19. And yeah, he's coming right out of turn 8. Those who know Pacific Raceways, you can see how they had the quote unquote safety hay bales set up there. And this race was kind of famous. Here's another picture of the field for that race. And boy, going down the cars, a Porsche RSK, Maserati Birdcage, Lotus 23, another Porsche, another Lotus, and on back Birdcage Maserati, Rattenbury's Wild Special. Neat car here, an HWM Lotus that was in the movie The Racers. Got quite a history, and it's still being a vintage race today. This was a really great field, but after about the top 5 or 6, it was mostly the top local guys. But look at the crowd up there. You can see this is just amazing. and how the area is still there. Now it's overgrown quite a bit. You can't get in the same areas, but just look at that crowd now. Interestingly enough, this is the start of the big, largest ever turnouts, the Pacific Raceways. They claimed 37,500 people here. And I I was there. No, I wasn't there. I had gone to college. Unfortunately, I had to miss it. But other people that were said it was incredibly crowded, and the traffic jam getting out was just awful. But 37,500, who's to argue, I guess. Anyway, it was a wonderful crowd and a great day of racing. One of the highlights was the two heats. And Dan Gurney's car had a mechanical problem, and the second heat was supposed to start, and the car wasn't ready. So the drivers called a drivers meeting, and they drug it on and on and on. Good sports, letting Dan finish. He did finish. He started last, but he still came through the whole field to win. Now we're on to 1963. There were two big races on the schedule. Now, there were a lot of club races, and they were really good races. It's too bad we have to just skip over them, but we're really talking about the highlights, which were provided by the biggest races of the year. Now, the USRRC, the United States Road Racing Championship, started that year. It was the SCCA's attempt to introduce professional racing on their terms, and it was a big national series. There's a terrific book written by a Northwest author, Mike Martin, on the USRRC, and it's a big, thick volume, hundreds of pages, hundreds of photos, and really shows how big a deal this was. It sure was in 1963 here, just a few months after the Northwest Grand Prix. Here came, and this is Pedro Rodriguez in a Genie. He won the race very easily. But what really was exciting was the appearance of the Cobras, and there are a lot of great pictures of the Cobras in that race. And I chose not to use one. Thought I'd use one in the pits. There's Ken Miles. These Cobras were new. They had just raced the previous fall in Southern California, and they were being sold around the country, but in very limited quantities. And all of a sudden, three of them showed up. In Carol Shelby's team was Ken Miles, Bob Holbert, and Dave McDonald, and they really cleaned house. They just did an amazing job. There were two races in the USRRC in those days: the manufacturers race and the kind of open drivers race. And the manufacturers race was for more or less production cars, and Cobra was being stretched to call it a production car, but so were the Ferrari 250s that raced against them. And the three Cobras just dominated that race. And I was there, and I can just remember they were just flying around turns 3A and 3B where I was watching, and just dominating everything. And then they came back in the open race and did extremely well in that too. I think they came in 4th, 5th, and 6th, or right around there. Beat a lot of big, much bigger bore modified cars. Well, that year, 1963, also saw the next big race that year was the Northwest Grand Prix. Again, that was supposed to be the Pacific Coast Grand Prix. They were still trying to get it going, but we held the Northwest Grand Prix. And that year we had a heck of a field but it was supposed to be a lot better. Gee whiz, the program talked about Jim Clark being there, the whole Cunningham team. But some kind of cool cars came up, including this car that driven by Lloyd Ruby, which he was more known then as an IndyCar driver, even though he was a heck of a road racer. And he beat all the better known road racers that day in this Lotus. And a couple of interesting cars. Sorry, it's not a better picture, but this is really worth noting. This was one of the first Chaparral was up here that year. It didn't do great. It looks kind of awkward, as a matter of fact, but it was the beginning of several year run for Chaparrals, where they dominated things nationally and up here in the Northwest, as we'll get into in a minute. That he's passing a Maserati Birdcage, which is also already getting pretty much outmoded by 1963. And you can also see the Chaparral was a front engine car, as was the Birdcage, and that was soon to change. Okay, does anybody have any questions or comments? I'm kind of don't hear a thing out there. I'm hoping everybody is following with rapt attention. Lily?
Yes, so there was someone in the Q&A. Dave said, all arms and elbows Innis, Ireland opens with crashing car in 1960, so the track was new. Was the course run counterclockwise back then? I seem to remember him mentioning it, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, it was, but not in any of the races we're going to look at. It was run sometimes counterclockwise, but it was more, it was a club race. Again, I apologize to the club racers. That's what my old man was and all of his friends. It was run backwards and occasionally. Innis Ireland wasn't there, though. He was there in 1963. He wasn't there in 1960. He got in a really bad accident, got pinned in his car for uh, several minutes. In fact, I mean, like something like 30 minutes or so. His car went off the course and hit a turn worker's car. I don't know where on the course, but anyway, so that's when he was there in 1963. I see somebody else confirmed the fact that that the Rattenbury special, uh, was rebuilt and driven by Tony Campbell. I don't know if that's Gregory Campbell that submitted that thing, but great if it is. Gregory Campbell, who races with us now, is no slouch himself. So, boy, any questions or comments? I've been writing books about history in the Northwest and nationally for some years now, and I do a lot, and it's really a hobby. I know an amazing amount about the racing in the Northwest. However, there's even a more amazing amount to know, and by no means do I think I know everything. And if somebody wants to correct me, that's how I learn too. So don't hesitate. I won't be embarrassed. I don't think so. Anyway, here's at the U.S. Road Racing Championship, the King Cobras came up. Well, there's a fierce looking car. There they are in their paddock in the pits with that power plant. See, they're doing a lot of work on it right now, obviously, but they made him out to the races. Here's here's pictures of a really unusual car. In 1964, if cars could talk, I wish this one could talk. This car actually still exists today. It's in a anonymous vintage racers warehouse. It's called the Harris Special. Here it is on the left. You can see what a wild looking car this was. It was not built as a street car, but it was driven to the track. It was driven by a young hotshot designer in Seattle who went on to achieve great things nationally and internationally, Trevor Harris. Well, he brought this car out to the track a few times for some testing, and it was entered in the 1964 USRRC race. Here's Lou Florence getting in it. Unusual looking car, obviously front engined, already outmoded, but fun to see what it could do. It's got a lot of interesting local ties. One is that some of its parts were Maserati, and the Maserati parts came out of Formula One Maserati cars that were in the movie The Racers in 1952 with Kirk Douglas. And a local guy, this is a wonderful story, a local guy named Tom Carsons bought all the cars so we could get that HWM Chev we saw earlier. And the parts were bouncing around. Trevor Harris got a hold of them, built this special. Now, in those days of Pacific Raceways, and I could have pointed this out earlier to better, but anyway, the paddock, you can see to the left, right here, the left of this picture, you can see cars there. The paddock was right on the course. You came out of turn 9 and you went zooming up the straightaway, and the paddock was right there. Obviously not right next to the course, but almost. Well, what happened in that race? Bob Holbert came screaming out of turn 9 in his King Cobra, had a mechanical problem and went screaming into the paddock at very high speed. And he demolished the Harris Special. And Stan Burnett, another good racer from the area, was sitting in it, got a bad concussion, and people got thrown around like rag dolls. Several people were hurt. Amazingly, nobody was killed. It is amazing. Bob Holbert retired from racing after that, and the Harris Special was never rebuilt. But like I said, it's around. I don't know how rebuildable it is, but we'd sure love to see it out again. As a result, that was on Saturday. Well, some Saturday night, somewhere Pacific Raceways, maybe in their own storage, got a bunch of hay bales, and they built a hay bale wall about 4 feet high all along this area. And then soon after, the paddock was moved back to where it is now. But like a lot of things in racing and a lot of other places, nothing happens until something forces it. You know, and that, pardon me, certainly forced that issue. So here we go in 1965. And some of you that are purists, hang on to your stomachs. Look at this beautiful D Jaguar chopped up like this. Big hood scoop, the fenders chopped up to accommodate some big tires. This is a famous car. It raced here all through the late 50s in the hands of the aforementioned Jim Rattenbury. And a guy named Star Calvert got a hold of it. And Star is a famous driver. He was a fascinating character. He achieved a fair amount in racing, but he got with Stan Burnett, and they put a Ford 427 in this Jaguar. Interesting story. The engine ended up hanging in a tavern down in Rainier Valley for years before it went to Florida and was used to power a boat. And the car, which was totally demolished in a spectacular wreck later on at Westwood, was rebuilt totally. The engine, they rebuilt or found the engine. The car is now in just beautiful condition and is worth several $1 million, as you can imagine. But here, to Star Calvert, it was just a race car. How could it go faster? Put a bigger engine in it, put bigger tires on it. Here's the Northwest Grand Prix. Phil Hill, one of the great drivers in U.S. history, was nearing the end of his career, but he came up and drove, did fairly well. A lot of people were saying he was over the hill. He still could turn in some hot laps, as he did in the Northwest Grand Prix that year. But here's the stars of that whole summer, the Chaparrals. I mean, what spectacular cars. I don't think that these cars are really made to be beautiful. They're brutal, but they are beautiful. Fantastic cars. And they were very, very successful. They won a lot of races around here. They won a lot of races nationwide. You can see there, look at the engineering. This outtake system, the exhaust system, the manifolds, really pretty amazing cars. And you can see this is after the race. Everybody is gathered around to look at these cars in rapt attention. I was there at that race, and I do remember them well. Can't find myself in the crowd, which is probably just as well. Now, talking about crowds, here was the crowd for that year. You can see it's a beautiful day. That hill, again, is really crowded, perhaps even more packed than it was for the 37,500. And this is something that happened a lot in those days. The crowd here was given as an all-time biggest crowd in history of the track, even though it wasn't 37,500. It seemed like every time the track had a good turnout, they always said it was the biggest crowd in history, even though it was smaller than the previous year's biggest crowd. But whatever, it was still a big crowd, and boy, would we love to see that again. Moving on to 1966. We've, again, the USRC. Oh, in 1965, there was no Northwest Grand Prix. No, I'm sorry. There was, getting out of sequence here. In 1966, the US Road Racing Championship was again held. And here is Lou Florence, our own Lou Florence, leading the field in a Genie Chev, and you can see the rest of this field stretching up behind him is extremely potent. We got the top drivers. The USRC was still attracting top drivers, and we got them here. The one that was the most top driver was Mark Donahue. And here's I'm sorry, I have a couple of feature photos kind of out of sequence. This is Charlie Parsons, the winner of the Northwest Grand Prix USRC and his wife having a celebratory bottle of champagne. Okay, we're going into 1967 here. And here is Mark Donohue. The year before, he had won his first big race here. And in a similar car, first big race of his fabulous career. He really liked Pacific Raceways. In fact, I have an article about how to drive Pacific Raceways. One of the things that's interesting about Mark, some people in Formula Vs could do this. Mark, and I don't know who else, but he in particular could drive the whole back straight of Pacific Raceways flat out. So it was almost an oval track to him. It's amazing when you look at the turns on the back straight to Pacific Raceways, turn 4, 5, and 6. That's a sharper configuration than it was then. I don't think Mark Donohue or anybody else could do that today, but it's still, most people had to at least slow down, if not brake for that turn. And Mark take it absolutely flat out. You know, we hope that everybody is familiar with Mark Donohue and all the incredible things he did here. Question came in, did Roger Penske ever race one of the Chaparrals? No, he did not. He may have driven one practice, but Roger, by the time the Chaparrals came out, Roger Penske had just about quit racing entirely. I mean, Roger never raced here in the Northwest. His cars sure did, but he was a fabulous driver and smart, as he still is, of course. He if you come out to the historics this year, which we'll talk about, the Zurich Special may be out there. He had built a very special car, a modified Formula One car, really, and he raced that with great success, and he kind of quit at the top of his career, which was really smart. Racing was dangerous in those days. A lot of guys didn't come out of the 60s, and he became a businessman. The Penske team, the Penske trucks. He had a great race career and he had a great business career. So more power to him. Here's Mark Donohue. He's ahead of a local guy, Bill Eve. Mark is going on to win the 1967 USRC race. Mark is now driving a Lola T70, as is Bill Eve. One of the most beautiful race cars of this era, mid-60s. It was very successful. It's certainly also one of the best looking. Now, in 1967, the Trans Am came to Kent, and this was, you see the date, October 7th and 8th? Well, this was going to decide this championship. Now, Trans Am is probably as popular a draw for vintage racing as anything is. And it was incredibly popular at the time. I remember this, not the race, but this era real well. The pony cars, so-called, were tremendously popular with young men in those days. Geez, probably young women too, but particularly young men. And they were the Trans Am series was nationwide. Whoever won it was going to be tremendously prestigious and result in a lot of sales. Here's Mark Donohue in one of the Penske Camaros in that race. However, the race was won by this guy, Ronnie Buckham, who, and by so doing, he won the national championship for Mustang. It was kind of an upset. Ron was a heck of a good driver, but it was an upset, and the Mustangs were not really favored to win the Trans Am series, but they did, and that really helped cement Mustang, as if it needed much help, as like one of the absolute most desirable cars of the day. That 1967, oops, I'm getting ahead of myself here, behind myself, sorry. That 1967 Trans Am race is really famous for another thing. A local driver named Russ Harness ran into the back of another driver named Jerry Titus. And, I've got pictures and more stories of all these things, and I've used them before. So I have one of this. Titus was run into the back of by Harness, and it was probably the turn workers all said it was Titus's fault. He was slowing too much in the middle between turn 3A and 3B. But Titus came out with this famous quote. He said, "We got to be careful. We can't let these local yucks," that was his word, local yucks in these races. They're making it too dangerous for us top drivers who've got a lot to lose by this. Well, Harness, pretty smart guy. He went out and he made local yuck buttons and local yuck bumper stickers and local yuck t-shirts and sold them. And I remember they were in competition press for sale. And he said at the time, which is pretty good money, he sold several $100s worth of these local yuck memorabilia and mementos. Well, moving on to 1968, it was getting, the USRRC was has been often called a precursor, a forerunner of the Can-Am series, the incredible, successful Can-Am series. But the USRC for a few years, 3 years, shared the limelight with Can-Am, but there's no question the Can-Am races were far more successful, far more popular. The USRC kind of went on all year, but when Can-Am came on later in the racing season, it just dominated everything. And people used the USRC as kind of a tune-up for Can-Am. So this was the last race for the USRC nationally and locally, of course. I'm using an interesting picture here, not two of the very top contenders in the USRC, but it's Don Jensen and Stan Burnett. And Stan is in one of his really wild-looking Burnett specials. For a few laps, this car can compete with just about anybody. And Don Jensen was driving an earlier rendition of an earlier edition of the Burnett specials. This car is still around, the number 0, Don Jensen's Burnett. It raced vintage with us for a few years, and I'm really sorry that it's no longer doing so. It's around though, and maybe it'll come out to the track someday and we can at least look at it. Well, Trans Am that year was back, 1968. The series had already was going to be decided later at Riverside, but it was very hotly contested. And just, gee, the rundown of people who were here, Parnelli Jones and Dan Gurney, Jerry Titus. And here's a guy who's still around and has shown up occasionally at our historics, George Fulmer. And George was a tremendous driver, very talented, drove a lot of cars. In this one, he really wowed the crowd by driving several laps, absolutely flat out with his hood flapping like this. And it didn't come off. It was, he did not get yellow flagged. He finally came in under somebody else's yellow flag, and of course got the hood reattached. But it's amazing. You imagine this car flying around 150 miles an hour down the straightaway with a hood like that. Here's a great picture of the start of the Trans Am race that year. Just about everybody who was anybody in Trans Am was there that year. You can go, it's being led by Jerry Titus, the aforementioned Jerry Titus, with Mark Donahue in second there. You can see the fields here. We've got Camaros, Mustangs, Firebirds, all the only thing that wasn't really out there that never really made it were Chrysler products. Everybody else was in there doing their best. 1969 saw the first Formula 5000 in the Northwest. Pretty big series nationally, never really caught on as much as they thought. It was supposed to be the American Formula One. It was fairly successful for a few years, and one of the most successful drivers in it was this gentleman, Mike Irely. He started racing at Shelton. He raced all through the 60s in Pacific Raceways, and he came back to race Formula B, the support series for Formula 5000. He was dominant. He won it every year. And here he is racing at Pacific Raceways in 1969, where again, he won Formula B. Here's the leaders in Formula B Formula 5000 that year. It's being led right now by Sam Posey. And this series, even though it may not have been as popular as they thought it would, did attract terrific drivers. John Cannon is second. There's all kinds of top drivers. Mark Donahue's back in there. This is obviously turn 3A. Well, the 1969 also saw the third edition of the Kent 300, the Trans Am race. I threw in a picture here because I wanted to of one of our real great drivers from the Northwest that never really probably got the recognition he deserved. Joe Cunningham. He raced this Camaro very successfully locally. He raced it nationally and as other cars. He's out of Oregon. He was one of the last of the World War II vets still racing. He raced until the late 70s, and he had quite a story from flying bombers in the South Pacific during World War II, and really a wonderful guy and very good driver. So, but here's the stars of the 1969 Trans Am race: is Parnelli Jones and Mark Donahue. Or Dan Gurney, sorry, Dan Gurney's in number 2. In 1969, as we'll see, the track was kind of winding down as far as road racing goes. Now, we'll get into some other things that it did, but it went out with an incredible bang for road racing that year. The Trans Am race, the Formula 5000 race, and the first ever annual, that's sadly, it says first annual, Dan Gurney 200, the track, Bill Donor, the track head of the track in those days, was a friend of Dan Gurney, got him to lend his name, and it's okay to have a USAC race all year long. This race was bandied about. Were they going to have it? Were they not? Were they going to have it? Were they not? It ended up being held, as you can see, late in the year. Not too late, but weather gets a little dicey as October gets further along. And they had an interesting weekend, beautiful day on Saturday, start of a nice day on Sunday, and then it poured rain for the finish. But here, we had never seen cars like this out here. We haven't seen them again. Here's Mario Andretti flying around turn 3B in a USAC championship oval track car. And here's the field at the start. I mean, again, Andretti's in the lead. There's Dan Gurney. I mean, this is an incredible field, possibly the most, you could say it may have been the most prestigious race we had here, certainly in the late, well, that and the Trans Am race. But unfortunately, this was the only Dan Gurney 200 that was held. It was a very popular race. I put my programs out here. This program is still around a lot. A lot of people went to it. Because of the rain on Sunday, the crowd wasn't as good as they thought. They never held another Dan Gurney 200. However, open-wheeled cars were back in the Continental race the next year. And you can see wings suddenly came into vogue in a big way. Every car that year in the Formula 5000 Continental Champion, L&M Continental Championship, every car had a high wing. It's pretty cool looking at them. How many came off? How many, didn't really do their job? We don't know, but it was quite something to see. Also, Trans Am was there that year. It was the last Trans Am. Trans Am was at its height, and it went down like a stone. Gas rationing, concerns about fuel economy, safety, all these things came into play. Just took the guts out of this series, and it limped along for another year or two, and then it and Can-Am both became extinct. They were both revived in different formats, but nothing like it had been. Here's Mark Donahue and Parnelli Jones leading the pace lap. And here's a last salute to Dan Gurney. It was one of his last races of his career. He raced the Trans Am that year in a Plymouth Charger, which didn't do great. Now, the track was really changing its focus to drag racing, as everybody, I'm sure, knows. Geez, it was right about then was the first years of the big drag races, 64 funny cars. The NHRA was going strong out there. So, you know, they had spent a lot of money. They did the best to promote like these continental races, just didn't get a crowd. The drag racing is where the action was. And naturally, the track, you know, was started by the Fiorito family. They weren't in it to lose money. And thank goodness they saw their way clear to hold the track, keep having profitable drag races. But we had a top road race here, the Continental 5000, the L&M Grand Prix, and David Hobbs, who's probably known to all of us as a Formula One announcer until recent years, won the race that year. Again, a terrific field came out for the event. Now, you could really say the last attempt to really put on a big race was 1972. Don't even have a picture from that race. Look at what they were going to have the same weekends, 2 weekends in a row. They used to race limited hydroplanes on Green Lake. Boy, I miss those days. A lot of fun. Limiteds on Green Lake, a big car race, a Seafair 200, a Formula 5000 race on Saturday, and then the next day, the hydro race. But the only one that really drew a big crowd was the hydro race, and Pacific Raceways lost more money. And from then on, they decided they were not really going to hold a big road race. We limped along. There were some Trans Am races, like here in 1983. Willie T. Ribbs won it, and the club racing, SCCA racing, went on. And I don't know much about those years. I was away from racing during that time. It might be at some point, maybe somebody could come on and tell the history of Pacific Raceways. Certainly a drag race history would be great. And the road race history in those days could also be interesting. Once a year, there was a fairly big Trans Am weekend, off and on through the years, 1977, 83, 84, but nothing really big. In 84, a very famous driver was here. I can't find any information about that race other than a newspaper clipping, and Dale Earnhardt won the stock car race, the West Coast stock car race that year. But even his presence didn't get a lot of people out, and the road track was deteriorating. You know, all the money for course maintenance went to drag racing. The road course was getting ahead of myself. The road course was deteriorating so much that they actually put out cones in the course to mark places that there were a big dip in the course. But in 1987, 88, 89, something came along that really buoyed up the track as far as road racing goes. And this is a whole nother history. It's a history of vintage racing at Pacific Raceways. And from the 90s, we saw some big time cars and some big time drivers as guests here racing at the Historics weekend, which is coming up here in 3 weeks by a strange coincidence. And I think everybody knows, I hope everybody here knows about that, is planning to come out. Terrific event, still get a lot of very good cars out for it. And in the year 2000, the Fiorito family came back and really took over control of the track. Jason Fiorito in particular, they really committed to doing a lot with the track. Some of their big plans came through, some did not. The facility has been upgraded constantly, and it's very exciting right now. Well, last year, they had repaved the whole road course. It's much, much better. It's on par with any place in the country. And it's still Pacific Race was just a gorgeous facility. You know, every bit of bare pavement has been scraped off. Well, this year, we're going to have the traditional historics. I hope everybody, like I said, that's on here is coming out to take part in the historics as a competitor, as a volunteer, as a spectator. We're also having a swap meet this year. You can go online and get tickets, or you can just show up day of race. 3 days of racing. While you're out there, you'll see something really exciting. The track is putting in some big permanent buildings As you come in to buy your tickets, you'll see to the left, all the ground has been plowed up with some beautiful industrial grade gravel exposed. That's another story. And there are going to be permanent buildings back there that can host all kinds of things, from restaurants to, but mainly really great garage space for all kinds of purposes. And we really hope that race cars will be the main thing using them. So we've got a few more minutes. That's kind of the end of my presentation. I wanted to leave room for questions. I see we've got some.
Yeah, it
And
looks like a lot of them are comments, but if you want to read through some of them and comment back on them, we've had a very lively Q&A and chat
yeah,
session. So thank you all so much for participating and having that dialogue back and forth.
it got some interesting comments. One from Vince Howlett, who is a person that is probably the greatest historian, certainly of Canada, and knows an enormous amount of racing down here. He said that what happened to George Fulmer in that great picture with his hood up in the air is he shunted a gentleman named Horst Queck's Mustang off the track. For that grievous, error, he was fined all of $60 and never paid it, as a matter of fact. That, and another correction is very true. That was a bad mistake on my part. Dan Gurney was in number 48, one of the last pictures, was driving a Plymouth Barracuda. There's no such thing as a Plymouth Charger, which I said. He was driving a Barracuda. So I want to mention that if anybody is, this was such a hurried presentation. I have published a book about 1960s racing in this area. Here it is. It's called Weekends of Glory. It's still available at a greatly reduced prices now. I've had it out for a few years. I tried to avoid using the same pictures in that book in tonight's presentation, but that book goes deeply into every race that I talked about, results, a lot more photos, everything else. Somebody mentioned here that about the landslide at the track, that it happened at turn 5. That's another interesting Pacific Raceways history. Pacific Raceway is built on a gravel pit. And originally it was the gravel pit for Fiorito Construction. They owned it as a gravel pit and they built the racetrack on it. Any gravel pit's going to have a lot of water running through it. And there still is occasionally a little problem at turn 9 where the track can buckle a little bit, but it washed through to turn 5, the other end of that spring, and washed away turn 5, and it was rebuilt. According to Jim Culp, it was rebuilt in time for the 1973 Formula 5000 race. And I want to mention what Culp said, that some of the field, which I didn't go into real deeply, but what a field. Formula 1 drivers here racing at Formula 5000. Brian Redmond, Jody Scheckter, Mark Donohue, Craig Ragazzoni, Peter Gethin. Incredible field for Formula 5000. Like I said, it just didn't really attract the attention that it should have. So nationally, it kind of went away. Oh, if anybody out here wants to experience Pacific Raceways in a race car and doesn't race themselves, got a good mention here that charity rides to benefit Children's Hospital will be available Historics Weekend. You can sign up there. You can go on the website. And for, I don't remember what it is, but it benefits Children's Hospital. It's a mock race, and people that were in it have said that it's a great experience, and it's very much like a race. You'll be riding in Pro 3 BMWs, which will be racing that weekend, but they'll also be giving you a great tour of the track at high speed and in company of other cars. But the closest thing you can get to actual racing. Well, I think I've answered the questions or responded to comments.
Did you answer the question, when did the name change to Seattle International and then back to Pacific Raceways?
Oh, sorry, 1969. It changed
1969.
to Seattle International. And I'm drawing a blank, and I know this, of when it turned back, but I believe it was the late 90s. it was, a lot of people still refer to it as Seattle International. And because that was what the drag strip was, and there were so many commercials. Anybody who was living in Seattle in the 70s, 64 funny cars, 64, and more commercials for drag racing at Seattle International. I had a question, came in, it said, my first memory at the racetrack, I saw a 917 circulating on the road course. There's never a 917 racing here, as far as I know, in an actual race, but they do demonstration laps, and they've raced in historic races here. This is an interesting thing. This person said they saw a 917, a Porsche 917, which is just an awesome, one of the all-time classic sports cars. I've never seen a picture of it or heard of it racing. At Pacific Raceways in those days, they did have 906s racing, which is kind of a step down from the 917. Looks a little bit like it. That's possibly what the person is thinking of. If anyone knows that a 917 ever raced at the track, I'd sure love to hear about it. And another guy said, did small bore Trans Am race cars ever race at Pacific Raceways? They absolutely did. They were a support race for the Trans Am. We had some wonderful racing from some local guys, as well as the national circuit. Milt Davis, Wade Carter, some people from Portland raced Porsches in those races very successfully. They had Alphas racing them, Datsun 510s. They were terrific races, and I have pictures of them, as well. I just couldn't show everything. Another question, your last presentation, is it on YouTube now? Kelsey, you want to answer that?
Yes, I was actually just checking, and I'm posting the link right now in our chat of both our website link where you can access the videos, and I'm pulling up the one for YouTube right now. So give me just a moment, and then we can pull it up on there. It should be up on there. I haven't gone through all of the videos. There's a few of them right now, but it should be on there. So let me post that link right now. Okay, perfect. So there is the link for the website where our videos are at, and then also on the YouTube channel.
Saw a comment. James Davis, where can you buy that book? Well, I'm going to make a commercial here. There's a website called Rudo Mart, RUDO-Mart.com. The book is for sale there. That's your best rate. It's also for sale on Amazon. And I also want to mention on Rudo Mart, you can find a lot. I'm just getting this going. You can find a lot of other photos from Northwest Racing all through the 50s and 60s. I'm just getting it going, so there's only a few years on there, but there's a lot of great photos. Excuse me. And Mary Zeitner said, oh, this is interesting. The ads for Detroit Dragway were the same. Maybe the 64 funny cars was a national phenomena. It probably should have been if it wasn't. Okay, I think that's the last comment. I appreciate everybody's comments, and I sure enjoy doing these things. I feel like I just raced right through it. There's so much detail that I could give, but I got to say, I really appreciate the opportunity to share my wonderful memories and these wonderful photographs of this great racetrack, which I cannot emphasize enough. It's still going strong.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us, Martin. And I apologize if I missed you answering this question because I was trying to find our YouTube channel. But did you answer James's question of did the small bore Trans Am cars ever?
They did.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. I am clearly great at multitasking if I can't listen and type at the same time. So awesome. No, we really appreciate you coming and you sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. This, like I had mentioned at the beginning, this will be recorded and it will be up on our website. It usually takes about a week or so for us to get it up there. So stay patient. It will be up there eventually. Any other questions? I know we've gone a little bit over time, so please do not feel obligated to stay, anyone. But if you have any questions, we are here to answer them for you. No? All right. Thank you again all so much. Always keep an eye on our website. That's where we have the most up-to-date information about upcoming events at the Car Museum. I know I mentioned this at the very beginning, but this weekend, Father's Day weekend, we have a lot of fun activities going on both Saturday and Sunday. We're open from 10 to 5 p.m. and events, I believe, are from 10 to 4. We have our family steam day that's going on. There will be barbecue and beer on the plaza as well. A lot of the hoods of the cars at the museum will be up too, so you can look underneath them and check out everything there. And there's just a lot of fun things. So if you can come this weekend, great. Otherwise, we're open Friday through Sunday from 10 to 5. And we hope to see you all there sometime soon. And thank you again so much, Martin. We really appreciate having you here with us.
Thank you for the opportunity. I certainly appreciate it.
Yes, thank you again. Thank you all, everyone, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.